Hey everybody, today we are going to spend some time getting to know Red or the 240SX. I have owned this car for the better part of a decade now, and I've never truly given it its own video. Sure, I did videos like working on it, but those were so early into me making videos at all that, well, frankly, they're just not very good. So I feel like it's time to truly give this car its moment to shine. This is a 1991 Nissan 240SX. It is an S13 chassis. That means that it's basically the first generation of the 240SX. I really got into them basically when I first started driving in like 2005. This is actually one of 7 that I have owned. This is the only one that remained though. This one has become mine. This is what I like to refer to as my canvas car. This is the car that's my always project. It's always evolving. There's always things going on with it. The main appeal to this car now is that it is one of very few KA24DE supercharged 240s out there. It is not centrifugal supercharged. It is a Roots style blower, and it's one of those like mythical unicorn builds that I read about since 2005. Like, it was always one of those things people were like, boy, that would be cool to do, or, you know, it would be interesting to see, but very few people actually went for it. Honestly, there's just so many drawbacks to it that it really takes a pretty mentally unhealthy person to actually tackle a project like this. No offense to Grant, who is basically the person that developed a lot of the Supercharger stuff for it. I think he just had the same sickness that I have. Before I bore you anymore, I'm just going to dive straight into everything about the Supercharger stuff, because I have a feeling that's what people are most interested in. So let's get under the hood and I'll take you on a tour on what makes all of that work. All right, here we go. This is the engine bay, and I'm just gonna go left to right, basically. So we start over here on the passenger side. We have here the intake that usually goes over to the driver's side. It is now much shorter over here on the passenger side. It has 2 hoses that go to an idle control valve. That idle control valve, I believe, it's been a long time, I believe is sourced from a Jeep, and it just takes air from before the throttle body and brings it to a port after the throttle body. This is the stock S13 KA throttle body, as well as the stock throttle position sensor. Underneath of that, we have a remote oil filter kit, and that is to mostly provide some clearance underneath of the Supercharger. The Supercharger hangs very low, and I actually had an issue where the Supercharger rubbed through the oil filter. It has since been relocated. Happy days really there, because that gave us a little bit more of an oil cooling effect, as well as gave a port for an oil pressure sensor that I use a Pro Sport gauge for, and it is really nice. It is a digital sender. There is no mechanical oil line into the cockpit. I really like that. Over here, just a simple fan controller. That fan is a stock S13, basically an AC condenser fan. Because I have a aftermarket 3-row aluminum radiator in here and no AC condenser in front of it, this car runs staggeringly cool, even in the hottest, sunniest, brutalest days of summer here in Florida. I have never once had this car overheat on me. Down here we have the water methanol injector. I do run water methanol spray in this car, usually water spray. I do mostly Autocross with this vehicle, and the SCCA does not allow methanol in the race cars. All right, moving on. So we got here, this is the back side of the throttle body. That takes air directly into the Supercharger. This is what you all wanted to know about. That Supercharger is off a Nissan Frontier. That is off of the Nissan Frontier V6. Never was this Supercharger offered on a 4-cylinder. The Nissan Frontier did have a KA24DE in it. It is a significantly different engine though, and it just was never offered supercharged. That Supercharger is bolted to a plate. That plate was basically pioneered by Knight Performance. This is an old company that made this basic kit back in the day. None of these parts are sourced from that. These are all handmade or CNC'd parts for this setup. So this plate here adapts the supercharger to the upper intake manifold from the stock KA. This is an upper intake manifold from a S14 KA, so it does not have secondary flappers in it. There's not that extra set of throttle plates to provide extra low-end torque or whatever the Japanese thought they were doing in 1991. So that is the one most recommended to use for this setup. Also on that plate we have air temperature sensor, we have a boost gauge sensor, and we have a vacuum line that goes to the ECU to provide a MAP sensor. You'll notice there's no MAP sensor on this setup. Moving up from there, we have the fuel injectors. Those are 370cc SR20 injectors. They are at just about the edge of their performance with this setup, but they are holding into a normal duty cycle. Controlling the fuel pressure, we have an Aeromotive fuel pressure regulator, and it's pretty much it for the top end there. If we move to the front, you got the Supercharger pulley and the plate on the front. That is making the belt for the alternator share the supercharger, and you'll notice there's only 3 ribs of a belt on there. That's by design. The stock pulley on the front of the engine only has 3 ribs all the way across. The pulley from the V6 is completely different. We go with 3 ribs. It has never slipped on me. That supercharger is not the supercharger on your NHRA Top Fuel dragster. It does not have nearly the draw. It does not need nearly the torque to require any kind of significant belt system. It works fine. If we were to move down, the front pulley has been modified. Not necessarily for the supercharger, but to put a ring gear on there for the ignition timing. So it uses a magnetic pickup ignition timing based off of the crank pulley. And up from there, you've probably already noticed that the distributor, it's missing a few parts. In fact, it's missing all of its parts. I have never put a plug in there. Honestly, I really could. This, unused distributor is causing parasitic draw. I highly doubt it's really doing anything significant, but it's redundant. It doesn't need to be there anymore. And that is because if we move back, you can see there is a coil back there. That coil is from a Ford wasted spark setup, and it is controlling all of the spark on the engine. It's what gives it a very, let's call it signature sound now. Basically, that wasted spark setup, it's batch firing cylinders, so you're also getting a spark on the exhaust stroke of the cycle. It gives it a really obnoxious sound, but it's a very simple setup. It works quite effectively, and basically that's it. It just works. Over to the right, you have the controller for that, and that is all Ford stuff. So we have Jeep stuff, we have Ford stuff, we have Japanese stuff, we have Frontier stuff. Pretty mishmash setup. Staying up front here, the hunk of metal in the middle, that's an aluminum head iron block S14 KA. This is a 1995 sourced engine. Not actually the most ideal engine to use for this setup because it has slightly higher compression and a slightly less aggressive cam. So if you really wanted to all out this build, you'd probably do an S13 KA, and you'd probably take some compression out of it. This is not what I would consider to be a perfect build. Nothing about this is idealized. On the right side, we have an OBX Racing header. That header is 8 years old. That used that when it was naturally aspirated for a long time. It is the steel version, not the stainless version. I don't like the stainless versions. They're really pingy. They get really hot. And even though the steel version looks ugly, it works way better, and it doesn't seem to require as much heat shielding, although heat is still a major issue with the setup. Other little things up here, we got ourselves an excess power dry cell battery, very small unit. It works fine. The car starts easily every time. So behind the engine, we have a 280ZX flywheel, a 280ZX style clutch. It is an Exeda unit. It's slightly upgraded from that, but it's known as the White Bunny clutch setup. It handles much more power. I actually spun a clutch in this setup using a, general performance regular S13 clutch. This setup does make a lot of low-end power, and that seems to not agree with the regular clutches for these cars. Inside of the car here, we have a Megasquirt MS2 3.0 ECU. The ECU, the supercharger adapter plate, and the front pulley plate, all of those were made and developed by a friend of mine years ago. His name was Grant. He originally kind of pioneered this setup. Well, maybe not pioneered the setup, but he certainly made it all from scratch himself. It was really cool. Unfortunately, he had to move on from the project, and I was really excited to kind of pick up the project and carry the torch from there. He also designed this fuse plate in here that I have, frankly, made a mess of. Right here on this haphazard plate, you'll see a snow performance gauge. That is the computer and gauge for the methanol spray system. And then above that, you have a Pro Sport oil pressure gauge, water temperature gauge, and a boost gauge. And that is it for the aftermarket, engine upgrades. That's pretty much the general tour of the car. Now I think it's probably due time that you hear what it sounds like. It's the number one question I usually get about this setup is, what does it sound like? Here is some audio of it driving, of it autocrossing, up close to the Supercharger, away from the Supercharger. I tried to get a little bit of everything for you. So as you can hear there, it's not really obvious that it's supercharged when you hear it. And I'm going to be honest, it really isn't that obvious when you drive it either. I would say the car drives more like a naturally aspirated car than any other forced induction car I've driven. I think that's generally an attribute of superchargers, and that's why I was always so interested in the supercharger setup. If you didn't pick it up from the name, the reason that I built this car, the reason that this car exists, is for autocross. Many, many years ago, I started getting into it. I've always autocrossed S13s, at least for my personal car. And this is basically just the latest iteration of that. I raced the car in a mostly street stock class for a long time, STX in SCCA Autocross. It allowed you to do some suspension mods, it allowed you to put some bolt-ons on it, but mostly it was a regular 240. Come around 2015, whenever the BRZ came out, the BRZ was introduced into the same class as this car. As you might expect, a car that is shockingly similar to this and 20 years newer, a lot better at Autocross than this. And it was pretty much right at that time that Grant said, hey, I've gotta, get out of this. I've gotta, sell my car. Do you want to buy the Supercharger setup? I was in no position to buy that Supercharger setup, but I scrapped together money. I begged and borrowed. I got help from the automation developers even to help get it. And I'm so glad that I did. I'm so happy to retain this setup. I've heard about this thing for so long. I would say half of my life I've known about this setup now. And sometimes I forget how cool it is that I actually have it. So like I said, it drives mostly like a naturally aspirated car. You just hit the gas and you get power. You don't feel it coming on boost. It just has an additional about 100 horsepower over the stock one. I think one thing that frustrates people is that the car is not good. It is not perfect. It is not shop built. It's not even, I would say, expert built. This has always been my car that I've used as a learning platform. Or like I said earlier, it's my canvas car. I just keep, painting a new drawing anytime that I feel like it's time to paint a new drawing, but I keep using the same canvas to do it. And the reason I do that with this car is this car was basically ready to be crushed. I really don't mind, doing the modifications to it and going the crazy routes, and even, I don't want to say like half-assing things, but I'm okay with the fact that I'm not a professional, I'm not, a speed shop, I'm not building it to some high caliber. This thing had the nose pushed in when I got it. It was all cut up. It was a mess. I got the car because my original project car got wrecked. Screw you, PT Cruisers. And this just kind of got born from there. It was really successful for a couple of years there in Autocross. I enjoyed learning how to drive the car. These cars are not ideal for Autocross. It's a lot of work to make them perform well. And I just can't wait for the continuation of that. I had to kind of pull back on the project quite a bit, but I knew it would always be there. And I'm excited to keep developing, keep writing new chapters for the car. We've pretty much burnt out all of the people that watch the 6-minute YouTube videos at this point, so now I'm gonna go into a little bit more rambly stuff, a little bit more details for those that really care about this kind of stuff. The car is painted in Fire Mist Red, that is a Mercedes color. I painted the car in my driveway when I was 23 years old or something like that. Never painted a car before, had no equipment, I had no idea what I was doing. It's not good. It's also been 8 years now. 8 years? Somewhere around there. So, it's chipped up, it hit things. The car got vandalized within 2 days of me painting it. So I just keep it pretty much as it is. Would I paint it again someday? Probably. Probably in the same color though. I really love the color. It's good for this car. I especially like doing the black top on them. The back has a GP Sports 3-piece spoiler. That's one of those things that I'm just like a little bit weirdly proud of because there's not a lot of them around. But I really like this spoiler on this car. It kind of mimics the original spoiler design, but no more foam that rusts out everything. This hatch still has some rust in it. The car was originally a Hikus car. It was a manual red Hikus 240. That is a shockingly rare S13. Unfortunately, this car was stripped of everything that made it a Hikus car by the time I got it. I ended up having to remove like the wiring for the Hikus system, the ECUs, all the fluff. Put a regular rear subframe in it. The only one thing that remains from the Hikus setup is the front brakes. So this was originally an ABS car, so it has slightly larger front brakes. To everyone that's always putting like big brake kits on these cars, if you're gonna do something like Autocross, don't waste your time. Just put a good set of pads on them. This car has plenty of brakes, especially for Autocross. If I wanted to track the thing, if I wanted to do like lap after lap runs, it would cook the brakes off. But for what I use it for, perfect. The wheels are XXR 962s. I got them for $150. They're horribly curb rashed. They're improperly sized 7-inch wide fronts, 9-inch wide rears. Probably the next thing to go, honestly. But I love the way they look. I love the way they look in white. I'll be sad to get rid of them. I can't find anything specifically for lug in that same pattern that I like. So we're probably going to be changing that up. I'll probably keep these though for like cruising. I don't generally cruise with a car much anymore, but I just love the way it looks on these wheels, so I'll be sad to get rid of them. I mean, I've always just done different little projects with the car, like the dashboard. I saw somebody doing suede flocking on dashboards. These cars notoriously have cracked dashes in them, so I did like, I don't know, a dozen of these dashboards, learning how to perfect that process. I never learned how to perfect that process, but what I ended up doing was fiberglassing one and then suede flocking it. That's what's in the car now. It's held up a lot better than most of them, but it's not perfect. And I don't care. I tried something. It's functional. It doesn't have any glare in the sun here in Florida. It's really useful. In the back there is a J30 limited slip differential. I'd love to change that out. That is one of the #1 things on my list to improve, because those J30 VLSDs, viscous LSDs, they kind of don't. It's like baby's first steps of limited slips. So I would love to change that out for like a clutch pack style limited slip someday. It's lower geared. It's like a 391 or something like that, which when it was naturally aspirated sucked. Now that it's got the extra power from the Supercharger, it's perfect for autocross, because I rarely have to go to third gear, which is great because third gear, not so great in this car. We've got the MagnaFlow 3-inch race series muffler into a downturn tip, 3-inch stainless steel exhaust system with a resonator up front. That's kind of it for my rambles. I hope you enjoyed our tour of the 240. I love the car. It's always going to be something that's here with me in some form or another. And like I said, I just look forward to developing it more over the next however many years that Earth lets me do that. So this is the great part of Superchargers. You want boost. It's there. Hey everybody, today we are out, just me, Red, my 240, and a lot of cicadas. And we're